Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Pokepreet podcast. I'm joined here by my co-host, Henri Martel, and of course, the lovely Breht O'Shea to talk about Fascism and Social Revolution by Arpam Dutt. It's a really great book that I think describes fascism perfectly. It was written in the 1930s, especially around the rise of fascism. Let's get the introductions out of the way, of course. Breht O'Shea, host of the Rev Left podcast, former host of Guerrilla History, host of Shoeless in Dakota. We've had him on the show before. Breht, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. Love being back on the show with you. Last time we collabed, the response from at least my listeners was very, very positive. So very cool to be back on here. Yeah, I host Rev Left Radio, co-host Red Menace. Shoeless in South Dakota is kind of a fun side project, not really political, but something I do with my friend who's in active recovery. So yeah, that's who I am. Thanks for having me on.
And then Henri, you're a bit of a new co-host. Do you want to introduce yourself just super quick?
Yeah, hello. Very happy to be here. I write on Substack under Henri Martel, and I'm working on YouTube channel at some point in the future. But yeah, I'm Marxist and love philosophy, history, and so on. And happy to be here.
Yeah. So jumping right into the book begins out with an economic critique of capitalism first. Like, it doesn't begin with fascism first. And why do you think Arpam Dutt does that?
Yeah, I could jump in and give some thoughts. I mean, obviously, I think all of these things, and as dialectical materialists, we understand that these things are deeply interrelated, right? These are not separate domains of study. Economics and political science, which is often separated in today's academia, is not functionally or in reality separate at all. And that's why, Marx talks about the critique of political economy. So if we're starting from an analysis of a social phenomena like fascism, good Marxism starts with the materialist analysis. And that almost always means starting in one way or another with the economic base.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like Arpam Dutt does a really good job of just distinguishing how a lot of liberal capitalism slowly devolves into fascism, right? There's a lot of contradictions that he mentions, right? The contradiction between the relations of production and the productive forces. And that's the one I think he really emphasizes throughout the book. And that is the big one that leads to fascism, because even in the 1930s, when he's writing this, he mentions we are currently producing more than enough to feed 4 times the population of Earth. I mean, that's the 1930s. I mean, imagine what we have now, right? So everything's artificial scarcity because it's owned by a small handful of billionaires. And instead of this technology, instead of these amazing gains helping out the vast majority of humanity, what does it lead to? It leads to economic depressions. It leads to people being laid off of work into the reserve army of labor. It's amazing how Marx was able to predict a lot of this, but also I'm kind of sad that Marx didn't live long enough to see the rise of fascism, like how all these contradictions inevitably foment themselves into a fascist movement.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned liberalism too, because I heard Zizek the other day. He said something like, "Oh, you don't understand. Trump's not a fascist. He's, I like to call him a liberal fascist." And I couldn't help but think to myself, "Oh, yeah, hasn't it always been that?" In terms of this view that the right ideas will triumph if you have some kind of free discourse, and that there really is no need for materialist analysis. You could say that when he starts with a materialist analysis, that's a little bit, it's almost cheating, because you're saying, well, of course, it has to be material because I'm a Marxist, and therefore I have to look here, for some explanation, and maybe not consider idealism or, the ideology itself too much. But I think that you can see pretty clearly that fascism reproduces, in certain conditions, material conditions, in certain stages of capitalism. And so it's definitely the most compelling and reliable way to understand its formation. I think that there's probably a lot more going on in terms of the human psychology, what exactly is appealing about fascist rhetoric. You could definitely talk for a while about that, but in terms of how it comes out of capitalism, you have to start from a materialist perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to add to that, I love the idea of getting into the psychology of fascism because it's rich terrain for sure. But I think a core critique of Marxists have for liberalism, and that liberals deny as just par for the course of their ideological orientation, is that, exactly as you said, liberal capitalism inevitably leads to fascism. If we understand fascism as capitalism in crisis, and capitalism is an inherently crisis-prone system, and liberalism defends capitalism, right? That liberalism is the political side of the economic system we call capitalism, then these things inevitably happen. And every time capitalism creates crisis, there is simultaneously an attempt to maintain the status quo in the face of obvious needs for change. And then often there is some sort of counterforce in society, a working class movement of one form or another, that is ready to challenge capitalism precisely in a moment of crisis to try to bolster its own position, right? In economic crises, it's not the billionaires and the elite who suffer the most, it's the working and poor. And so they have an automatic interest in confronting the system as a whole, which again necessitates a fascist response by the ruling elite. So it's really important for people to understand that liberal capitalism can only ever lead to fascism. And it does over and over and over again in history. And the only way we're going to get out of that cycle is by transcending liberal capitalism altogether, through socialism and eventually into communism. So you transcend the material conditions and the structural impetuses that create fascism in the first place. But as long as we think that there's a liberal response to fascism and that we can keep capitalism around and not have fascism, as well as imperialism and inequality, etc., we're going to live in a state of like a sort of doom loop. And we find ourselves, I think, in a similar doom loop here in the first quarter of the 21st century as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, within the liberal analysis, often the fight against fascism is portrayed as the fight against liberal parliamentary democracy against dictatorship. But, us Marxists, we recognize that liberal parliamentary democracy itself is a dictatorship of the bourgeois. And this dictatorship of the rich, it can take many forms. It can take a monarchist form. It can take a dictatorial form, like fascism, like a direct dictatorial form. Or it can take a liberal parliamentary form where there's this illusion of democracy. But eventually, right, there's so many contradictions within capitalism. Like, first of all, of course, class struggle. The inevitability of class struggle. There's people at the top, there's people at the bottom. The people at the top, the capitalists, exploit the labor of the people at the bottom. There's the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. We live in an era of immense abundance, and yet because commodities are produced for exchange value and not use value, the majority of them, the majority of homes sit empty while we have 600,000 homeless people. We have more than enough homes for everybody in America. And so there's just vast, and then the crises of overproduction and economic crashes, there's just vast dictatorial elements within liberal parliamentary democracy itself that lends it towards eventually devolving into fascism in order to keep up the bourgeois' hold and grip onto power. The only reason we're allowed to have democracy is because they can afford to give it to us, right? An illusion of democracy. But once they no longer can afford to give us that illusion, they're more than happy to take it away. And I think to some extent we're seeing that all across the world, not even just in America.
Yeah, I think, Brett, you made a really great point, or at least alluded to the point that it comes out of crisis, but it's not just any crisis. It's also, there are specific conditions. We can certainly think of lots of crises of capitalism that did not result in fascism. But when there is a real threat from the working class, especially if there's a, big labor movement, it becomes necessary to crush it with force, with, authoritarian means. Liberal democracy doesn't suffice anymore. And so it definitely feels like it's worth examining the specific historical circumstances. And also the fact that over time, now we have this kind of new sort of fascism, which is a little bit more stable, a little bit less aggressive, a little bit less, authoritarian or military oriented. And you can see how, members of the ruling class, members of the capitalist class have understood the destructive power of National Socialism, of Italian fascism, and they understand that while this might be in our interest to crush the workers today, we might want to be a little bit, more clever with how we go about this. So over time, it develops because it's not a scientific ideology. It's kind of a phenomenon, and it's tied to the specific economic conditions. For example, like Pinochet in Chile, people have a difficult time pinning down exactly what that was. Was it real fascism? Was it para-fascism? Whatever. And when you look at the circumstances, you see, well, it was a military dictatorship that, there were, specific economic structures, specific large landowners, for example, that really benefited from this. And so it had its own character. The US was really involved. So it's always really, I think, worth it to engage with the historical circumstances as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great example to bring up is the Pinochet example, because it was in the face of a rising, actually democratically robust and an elected socialist movement, backed by the CIA with the sole purpose of re-entrenching capitalists, the mode of production and social relations, defending it against this rising working class movement, and also be used by the U.S. Imperialist class as a place that they can exploit and not challenge not challenge capitalist social relations. And so it's kind of interesting, and I think it gives the game away, that historical example, to show the connections between liberalism and fascism. And then you have somebody today like Javier Milei in Argentina, who has outwardly said that his criticism of the Pinochet regime is that they didn't throw enough communists out of helicopters. He talks about himself as an anarcho-capitalist, right, which would be hyper right-wing libertarianism. But what do you get when you take hyper right-wing libertarianism? You just get fascism again, because the conditions out of which, the conditions created by libertarianism, which is just unfettered capitalist liberalism, you push that far enough, then you're going to get resistance, and then you'll require fascism to reinforce the class structure of society. So I think that's really interesting. And another thing you said, Henry, that was worth reflecting on is the fascism of today seems a little less aggressive, right? Like there is at least so far, things can obviously change and crises can deepen and things can get more violent. And I think they almost certainly will. But as of right now, what accounts for that seemingly less aggressive sort of fascism that's bubbling up? And I think it's in large part in here in the US and probably across the West, because there's a real lack of an organized working class or communist movement. In the previous historical iteration, you not only had the capitalist crises and all the issues economically that many of us face today, but you had organized, growing communist parties and militant working class movements that, in so many ways, when we can go into the reasons for this, aren't present right now. And so you need a little aggression with the economic crises, but because you're not facing organized resistance to capitalism itself, you don't have to go full, fucking Adolf Hitler type shit, at least as of now. So I think that's an interesting point. The very last point I want to make, I'm sorry, I'm talking a little too much here, but the evolution of class society, we think about like slave societies, ancient Roman Empire, and then medieval feudalism, and then industrial capitalism, and you go from slave to serf to worker. And that evolution is real. But one of the other aspects of that evolution, I think, is that the dictatorship of the rich has become more sophisticated and refined in the way it robs and exploits, right? From slavery, where it's just literally like, you're my property, whip on the back, enforcement of class hierarchy, to feudalism, where it's abstracted 1 degree, right? We don't own the serfs, but we own the land upon which the serfs work. And then in capitalism, it's abstracted yet again. We don't even need to own land and have people forced to work it for no pay. We own private property, and you can pick your job and you can apply to a different ones. And then we talk about freedom, and you're more free than a serf and a slave, right? So that the evolution of the dictatorship of the rich is not that it's gotten less dictatorial. It's that it's gotten more refined and sophisticated in its dictatorship. And I think that's worth noting.
Yeah. I think like a more precise term might be it's less militaristic, because following World War I, there were huge veterans associations and people who really couldn't adjust to civilian life after being part of World War One, and that really fed in to the movement in Italy and in Germany. This vision of a hyper organized or military state, and that's not really present. But that's, like you said, not a reflection of some kind of unwillingness or impotence, but rather a just different circumstance.
One thing I find odd is like they're using these anti-communist tools right now, currently, for a communist threat that doesn't exist. It almost sort of exists in their heads, and I think to some extent, I mean, I wish it existed. I think we all wish it existed, obviously,
Yeah.
but it doesn't exist. It kind of just exists in their heads, and they have to sort of invent it. Currently, there's this like cultural Marxism, and Marxism has taken over the universities. And you really dig deep into it, and at best, maybe it's like it's critical race theory, which it has like it's based in like some Marxist text, and its best, it's like a liberal who read Marx and is a professor. But there's such a cultural war against a Marxist threat that doesn't exist. And I think to some extent, it really is part of just capitalism's game, right? Neoliberalism and austerity is breaking down to a point where it's just sort of being forced to invent enemies that doesn't exist. And so now we've got Trump in office, and his whole administration is fighting against Marxist threats that don't even exist, because this is the stage at which we're at in the course of neoliberalism.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that gets into the psychology of fascism, which is absolutely fascinating. Is like this repetitive doom loop that we were talking about earlier. Like now that we're in another period of economic crisis that capitalism continues to create over and over again, and obviously creating worse and worse versions of it as the entire system decays and sort of loses its historical bearings. Like it's no longer historically serving us. The social relations of capitalism are increasingly acting as fetters on the productive forces. We have enough for everybody, but the social relations of capitalism refuse to allow people to have access to things, especially here in the U.S., like fucking healthcare and housing across the West, right? It's not just the U.S. There's some stark examples here, but it's a problem across the capitalist world. And then in that moment of crisis, there is a lack of the thing that's been present in the past, which is organized militant working class movements, but yet the sort of historical nightmare of that is still present in like almost the subconscious of the ruling class's mind, because Trump does not understand Marxism. Do we really think like Trump understands even the history of militant organized working class movements or communist vanguard parties or even the basic tenets of Marxism? No, it's an inbuilt psychological boogeyman that in previous iterations of fascism, that it actually was a threat. Now it's not as much of a threat, sadly, and hopefully we can change that. But yet the phantom of the threat still lives on in the subconscious, because again, Trump is not, and a lot of these reactionaries aren't consciously thinking like, okay, capitalism leads to crisis. We have to implement fascism to stop the rise of Marxism. It's just this fever dream ambient background of their psychologies that vomit up this communist threat that doesn't exist. And I think that's a fascinating insight in its own right, but also a sort of distorted and weird, disformed version of historical patterns.
I'll just hop in. I do think Trump is a secret Maoist. I do think he's like this accelerationist. But no, I mean, no, it really is odd. And, you'll see like libertarians, and you were mentioning like Millet and libertarian. You'll often see them like envisioning this like mythical capitalism that doesn't exist. Oh, it's everything's free trade, and, we all like live in harmony and kumbaya, and, we all are like small business owners. But I think what they don't realize is that capitalism inevitably leads to what we're seeing right now: trade wars, sanctions, imperialist interfighting, right? I mean, what is Trump trying to do right now? Capitalism is in the imperialist stage. Lenin recognized that in the 20th century. In the 1900s, it's gotten to a point once again where it's forced to fight for a dwindling market with its competitors. So what does it do in order to tap more into that dwindling market from, the global south? Countries that exploits? It puts on tariffs, it puts on trade wars, it yada yada, it does economic warfare. And libertarians, while they envision, this like small business owner, mythical capitalism, always inevitably leads to this. This is the inevitable conclusions: monopoly, finance, capitalism, and imperialism. It's just the inevitable result of the free competition of the market.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, like you said, there's also no, I mean, you could almost imagine them blaming Nazism, like, coming up with some phantom Nazi movement or, I mean, of course there is a bigger Nazi movement in the United States than communism, but yeah, I mean, almost anything you can kind of grasp at, as like this menacing enemy. I guess they're just going with the tried and true, classic immigrants trope, but and trying to do other things as well. But, it probably really won't be very successful. And also there's like, I think the thing that's interesting about today is that there's a real conflict between tech capital and finance capital. And finance capital is, I think, actually very apprehensive and very concerned about the prospect of fascism, because finance capital is very concerned about stability, maintaining debt payments, all of these kinds of rhythmic things. Whereas tech capital, and I read, if you read The Technological Republic, written by these Palantir guys, Nick Land, and all of these sort of JD Vance types, these people are really, they're idiotic in many ways, but they do have some kind of revolutionary vision. And they do have what you could maybe compare to fascism, because, they want this kind of technocracy, and, kind of just a dictatorship, of like software engineers. It's kind of how it exists in their heads. And so you have real legitimate conflict between these two sections of capital. It's not really like you just go to the big auto manufacturers and you go to the big steel makers and whatever else, and you've met all the capitalists in the country and you strike a deal with them as a fascist. There's a lot of chaos, and that chaos will make people more uncertain, more scared. And then I think also sooner or later we need to confront the fact that fascism can actually be pretty organic in some ways. The ideology can be organic, not just as a result of decay of capitalism. It exists in prison gangs, for example, or street gangs, or, neo-Nazis. They'll go around and beat people up, in the city. They're kind of these like lost, really violent people, losers basically. And the ideology really starts there. It starts with this kind of romantic fantasy, like I'm going to save the school, if I'm the school shooter or something, I'm this kind of like hero. And even like Hitler, was really obsessed with Richard Wagner's operas, these stories about great heroes, mythology, kind of esoteric lore. That's why they're also obsessed with Agartha, with Hyperborea, with all, they don't really care if it's true. It's just about, this is kind of a cool thing to be into. And there's this kind of romantic obsession with violence. And that really is ultimately, I think, starts as from the lumpenproletariat, from people who are just lost, who are upset or angry. It's co-opted by fascist leaders, and then they strike a deal with capitalism. And you see that right before the Night of the Long Knives in Germany, where they purged the Strasserites, the more explicitly anti-capitalist Nazis, out of the party after they, kind of struck a deal. And in Italy, there was a similar situation. So the fascist leaders really want power, and they come out of the lumpenproletariat, out of whoever will listen to them, whoever they can grift to, basically. And then they strike a deal, and there's this, violent military kind of dictatorship. But now the capitalism is capital is so diverse. It has so many conflicting and varied interests that, a guy like Trump really can't go, he might try, he might want to, but he can't really go to the tech billionaires and to the finance capital billionaires and say, hey, I'm going to institute, this horrific dictatorship, and we're going to start exterminating these people and give you a bunch of slave labor, because their interests are actually different. So that, you know, it's a bit scary because we don't really know exactly where it's going to go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think definitely the army of fascism is definitely the lumpenprole, so like people who have been thrown off of work, and the petty bourgeois, you know, like small business owners. But I think who's directing the army and who's really the main benefactor of it is the big bourgeois. And just like you said, it's transitioned into a tech bubble, finance capital. It's not the industrialists of the old age anymore, and it's really strange how they operate. I think to some extent that really is embodied by Elon Musk and how crazy and inexplainable he is. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to bounce off that as well because you're getting at like a new wrinkle in an old contradiction. So like an old contradiction is the contradiction between industrial capitalism and finance capitalism, right? And fascism is like an attempt to resolve a failed attempt, of course, but an attempt to resolve that contradiction. But with the tech capital in particular, it's like a new wrinkle. It's not, because you're right, finance capitalism, it likes stability, it likes long-term stability for its investment opportunities to unfold over time. But it is different than industrial capitalism in that it's like profit is extracted through speculation, through debt, through rent sinking. I mean, what is the American economy except for this hyper financialized fucking bubble that is about to burst? But there's this fascist nostalgia for industrial capitalism, right? Which is rooted in not speculation and debt and rent or debt and rent sinking, but in the direct exploitation of labor in like big factories. So we see this idea of like bringing back factories, bringing back manufacturing, but we're in a hyper globalized financial capitalist late stage situation where that becomes increasingly difficult. But then you enter the tech oligarchy that sees the rise of AI as a potential for the utter replacement of workers as such, as well as a sort of arms race for unimaginable profits, right? So they're very interested in anything short term to entrench their monopolistic control over what they see as like this next stage of brutal, parasitic, AI-driven capitalism. If they can lock themselves in through a warm relationship with the Trump administration during these crucial years that, whether they're right or wrong, they think is going to be the entrenchment and the rapid, almost exponential development of AI, and they can control that going into the future, they won't need workers. They can amass trillions of dollars in profit. And that short-term aggressive, like we have to do this now, this is basically our last chance, AI is coming this decade, that is at odds with other aspects of finance capital. So it's like finance capital versus industrial capital, the old contradiction, which is still very much alive. And then you have this weird offshoot of tech oligarchic monopoly seeking capital, which is kind of at odds in some ways with both, because it seeks, obviously, doesn't really care about the short or long-term stability of finance capitalism as much. And with regards to industrial capital, is seeking to obliterate workers altogether. And so I think that is a core contradiction that is new, right? That is genuinely new. And if even the slightly optimistic ideas of what AI can achieve come true, it's going to be a radically new moment of capitalism, and also put extreme pressure on capitalism itself, right? Because that worker boss exploitative relationship is the core of capitalist social relations. If you're trying to take half of that puzzle away and automate it, I mean, we already think like, well, what's everybody going to do? What's 70% of the population going to do? Well, we'll just wrinkle that contradiction with a UBI, but that's not tenable really either. So yeah, there's this new moment that I think is really, really interesting and giving rise to a very specific form of capitalist crisis.
Yeah, we need Andrew Yang. This is the pro Andrew Yang content.
Exactly.
Moving on from that, as much as fascism is scary, I think what's even scarier than that is the fake resistance to fascism, especially in the form of liberals and social democrats. And you're going to see this in history, right? So like in 1919 and 1920, the Italian workers, they were occupying the factories. They were ready to take over Italy. They were ready for revolution. And the PSI, the social democrats within the PSI, they abandoned that revolution. They said instead, oh, let's just make a deal with the Italian government and we'll win some temporary reforms. And those temporary reforms were immediately gotten rid of. And so really, the Social Democrats helped consolidate the win of the fascists by taking steam out of the workers' movement. Same thing in Germany, with the Spartacus uprising, the very famous Spartacus uprising, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht. The communists are ready. The German workers are ready to take over the state, and the Social Democrats, they back the Freikorps and they killed the communist leaders. And that's really the birth of some of the paramilitary of fascists in the Freikorps. How do we see any parallels between that and the modern day America, right? Like Bernie Sanders, AOC, their what's their tour called? The Unfuck America tour, or
Fight the Oligarchy tour?
Fight the Oligarchy. Yeah. How do we see any parallels between that, or is it a bit different?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. There is the difference always in the background of the lack of organized working class movements, but then you also see a difference today between liberals and social democrats writ large, where liberals have just given up. They're just completely lost. They have no answers. They confirm their biases with every new social development. So, figures like, who knows, like there's a million of these people, but like a Bill Maher type figure, right? Super rich establishment. They're not looking for any sort of change. They're not even pretending to think in the direction of economic restructuring. They're still hung up on like wokeness, and the Democrats moved too far to the left, and that's why they lost. Like these people are out to sea ideologically. But there's the other aspect, which is very small with regards to its impact structurally, like within the Democratic Party, which is the social democratic movement, but broad in society, right? There's a real desire, I think, from people for, a fight the oligarchy idea makes sense. And social democrats like Bernie are at least trying to address the underlying contradiction of, the economic basis of this new era of reactionary authoritarianism. But they're not actually capable ideologically, let alone materially, of solving the underlying crisis in any real way, because to actually solve the crisis would be to transcend this political and economic system, which they have tied their entire careers, and in the case of AOC, her entire future towards, not only just this system, but the Democratic Party itself. So their sort of delusion is that they can help turn the Democratic Party into a robust social democratic force that radically redistributes wealth with a donor base of millionaires and billionaires who don't want that at all. So that contradiction has to play out, because among the base, there's a real thirst for that. Like, regular people that aren't like caught up on political theory and don't understand the problems of capitalism, they understandably think like, let's just get like healthcare and housing and like higher wages and like we'll be okay. And that will probably actually, interestingly, prolong capitalism longer than this fascist accelerationism will, right? Like this is fascist accelerationism. It's just flying off a cliff and hoping you land with your wheels down. At least social democracy, from the perspective of the elite, has the possibility of extending the expired lifespan of capitalism a little bit. But again, there's too many contradictions to actually make that work. And to go to point to FDR and the New Deal, you're pointing to a very specific time in history where the possibility of building robust welfare states were present in a way that actually doesn't exist anymore. So you can't do a New Deal because the material conditions out of which the New Deal emerged were very specific to its time and place, right? Europe is in ruins. The U.S. is becoming the sole superpower militarily and economically. Right, with all European cities in ruins and their economies devastated. Very specific time where the U.S. With its industrial base can supply to Europe and the rest of the world in a profound way, and that's gone. So there is no going back to the FDR and the New Deal. The liberal establishment is completely just adrift and lost in ideology. Social democracy, at least, has the idea of the direction to go in, but lacks the robustness as well as the militancy, the grassroots militancy needed to push meaningfully in that direction. And so, there's new wrinkles for sure, but the same delusions and the same contradictions still exist.
Yeah, very good points. And I feel like that book the Ezra Klein like abundance book really exemplifies a lot of the ideological fetishism like of the Democratic Party recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing too because it doesn't like I think it's maybe a bit unfair to accuse AOC and Bernie of like sticking the free course on anyone because there's no communists and there's no Nazis. It's like hard to like it's hard to say like what how they would behave in different circumstances because we just don't know. But it definitely is the case that one, you can tell that they're both pretty unwilling to stand up to the to the genocide in Gaza, which is definitely a bellwether. It shows that like they're not really willing to put themselves on the line. Bernie back in 2016, 2020, he used to say, well, the only thing that will allow my policy platform in the US is millions of people in the streets. And that seems, I think, like he was, if the moment came, he certainly would not be, fighting the powers that be in that way at all. Given the fact that he's acquiesced so heavily on the issue of Gaza. And, in AOC too, when you see her talk, she's really like the ultimate liberal because she's very, very good at using leftist language without being a leftist or, at least a materialist. And, even when it comes to social democratic things, they don't really emphasize very specific demands like we want a single payer healthcare system this way, look at this on our website. There's a lot of platitudes, actually, even when it comes to social democratic policies. I don't know if you saw, but Hassan Piker actually interviewed Mélenchon the other day, and Mélenchon was pointing out, like, and most of us, we might think Mélenchon is kind of like the Bernie Sanders of France or something, but he was saying like, yeah, Bernie Sanders wouldn't really talk to us. He didn't really have any solidarity with us. He couldn't really get in contact with him or anything. And I mean, if Mélenchon is too far left for Bernie Sanders, I don't think over here we should be holding our breath.
I think that's a really good point in that, like, even if Bernie Sanders and AOC are good intentioned, they still sort of serve the same exact function as Trump. And, that's a radical, crazy thing to say, but it is true. Like, at the end of the day, they serve to strengthen and preserve capitalism. And the only way to stop fascism radically is to overthrow capitalism. It's that classic question, reform or revolution. And reforms, they can be done and they will be dismantled very quickly. I mean, we saw that with the Italian reforms, right? In 1919, the PSI, they got the workers of Italy some reforms. And what happened? They were used to distract the workers' movement for a little while because the Italian ruling classes were so afraid of a communist uprising, right? The 1919s factory occupations. And while their Italian working class was distracted, they put all of their focus into Mussolini's brown shirts. And the brown shirts became more and more powerful, and over time they took over. I don't think there's really a brown shirt in America right now that's growing. But again, Bernie Sanders and AOC, when they're only speaking towards, they're about as effective as fucking Nancy Pelosi in the black head garment, and the black power fist, like kneeling down. Like, they're not fighting the root of fascism and the root of Trump, which is capitalism. All they're offering is tepid reforms it's a Band-Aid on a dying system. And really, I think one of the reasons that we're not able to promise a New Deal anymore is the falling rate of profit. I mean, we have got into such an amazing amount of industrial output. The investment within a constant capital has gotten so high that we're not really able to hire that much variable capital under capitalism in America anymore. And all this technology doesn't serve humanity anymore. It serves a big business interest. So we've got a large unemployed class. Simplifying it for anybody that doesn't understand, the capitalists have put so much money into automation and technology that they can't hire workers anymore. And so we have a very large unemployed class. We have industrial output that's been outsourced to China and Vietnam and India. And so, while they dream of reforming capitalism going back, they all serve the same exact interests, right? Libertarians, social democrats, fascists. And it sucks to say, but they all serve the very same interest of preserving a system and going towards a mythical past return that's never going to happen.
Yeah, I did want to. I agree with everything, but I wanted to actually harp a little bit more on just briefly on the reform or revolution question, because I don't know that it's as straightforward. Like I definitely agree that there are lots of historical examples of social democratic or democratic socialist reforms playing into the hands of capitalists by maintaining the system, making it more tolerable for workers or delaying, inevitable collapse into fascism. But I think also there are lots of historical cases that people who are Marxists or Marxist-Leninists or, of the left, more militant left ilk aren't as interested in because if you take, for example, the French Revolution, it really was an aristocratic infighting, between the bourgeoisie and the nobility that gave the peasants an opening to revolt. It wasn't like the conditions got so intolerable for the peasants that they had no choice. And I think there are other examples of this as well, like in Russia. Actually, I mean, it wasn't like Russia in 1917 was the worst time for peasants. It was always intolerable. But sometimes if there are certain reforms or certain conditions, it can help, develop class consciousness. It certainly doesn't guarantee it. But I think we shouldn't always be so dismissive of moderate reforms, at least, not without looking at the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And sometimes I think, like, let's think about like the Chinese Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. All three real ruptural events occurred in a time of complete chaos and collapse. And for various reasons, obviously infighting amongst the elite, but also just wretched underlying economic conditions, military pressures, etc. And then I sometimes think also, what would the U.S. look like, right? We don't have an organized communist party. Even organized militant labor has been dismantled in a way that wasn't always the case in other places, including like the German situation with the failed German Revolution. I look to Latin America and I see us, kind of to your point, Henry, a different form of doing it, right? Because think of like Chavez in Venezuela, or even in
Bolivia.
Chile. What's up?
Or Bolivia's, yeah.
Bolivia is another great example.
Yeah.
Chile is another great example. In 73, obviously, before the Pinochet dictatorship. And they fomented and advanced a sort of revolutionary reformism that didn't take the form of overthrowing the entire system, but used the electoral terrain to advance not a milquetoast liberal social democratic program, but a sort of robust Latin American revolutionary social democratic program that always at the same time had to be anti-imperialist because of the world system they operate in, and was much more revolutionary than any manifestation of social democracy in the global north. That's another contradiction because the U.S. is in the global north. But I do wonder about some of those tensions, and I think all of us need to think deeply about what that means for us and how we should be sort of operating in that way. But I also want to just quickly gesture to your abundance point, and that is kind of the Democrats' hope at the moment. It's a flash in the pan. It has no staying power. Next year, you'll forget that book even existed, like Matt Iglesias' book, 1 Billion Americans, right? It's like there's a liberal ephemera that just gets puked out and then runs the ecosystem for a couple weeks and it fizzles out because it's utterly meaningless. But their whole idea is deregulate and build. Like, we need a liberalism that can build. And the first chapters of that book, they paint a techno-utopian future where, like public transportation is robust and AI is integrated into smart cities, and all the towers and skyscrapers have plants all along the sides so we can build vertical gardens in cities. And there's no class analysis whatsoever. It's like, how do you get to that AI utopian future? You think the AI overlords are going to build public transportation for the rest of us? No, we're going to get Blade Runner. We're not going to get some utopian, version because they lack class analysis.
Except
So
without the cool lights and the philosophical quandaries that make
we don't
it.
even get the philosophy and the neon.
Yeah, yeah.
Brett, are you
Yeah.
saying my grandchildren won't be reading What Happened by Hillary Clinton next to Marx in like 30 years? Like, that's a classic.
That's a future worth fighting for.
That's not, yeah. No, I mean, I think Henry's point is good. I think the question is like, who's in control of the reforms though? Or like, working within the system. Is it
Yeah, yeah.
completely in control of the working class, or is it in control of, because like going through the Democratic Party, the working class gives up its control to the bourgeois. I think it goes back to Marx's point about forming a working class party. It has to be 100% in the control of the working class. We can't have any control given to the bourgeois or any ruling party.
Mhm.
Yes, absolutely. That is the crucial point. If that's ever going to work, if that strategy is ever going to work, it has to be with that firmly in mind, and it has to be confrontational, militantly confrontational against the Democratic Party, their elite, their donor base, their consultant class. And that's precisely what Bernie and AOC are not willing to do, and that is exactly why they will fail.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like that is why the issue of Gaza is so helpful, because it's, I mean, that sentence out of context sounds awful, but when you look at people like Bernie, you know, if he was willing to come out on the Senate floor and say this is a genocide and really risk alienating a lot of people, you know, it wouldn't make me like a Bernie voter or whatever, but it would show that, okay, he's willing to, you know, be principled and really, you know, go against his political interests for something that he believes. But they're both so unwilling to do that, you know. Although it was interesting because Bernie, to his credit, he is much more class focused than AOC, who kind of ignores that. But he was really the one getting the crowds early on. And the Democratic Party, I haven't looked too into this, but it feels like they sent AOC down there to kind of capture a lot of that energy, you know, that Bernie was getting. You know, they're still like absolutely terrified of left-wing politics, even stuff that's as docile as Bernie.
Yeah.
Well-
AOC is like, yeah, this protege. I think Bernie has real affection for her, and I think he sees her as the torch carrier. Obviously, he's getting very old and like the only person in the Democratic Party, because again, he's not willing to confront the Democratic Party or run against it, that he sees in that bullpen is AOC as the possible, you know, but she's much more. I mean, they're both careerists. I think that's clearly obvious, and I think AOC is a mixture between Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders. She likes the progressive rhetoric, and I think she would, more than the average Democrat, support some progressive reforms, but within limits. But one thing she's not capable of doing, and neither is Bernie, is really confronting the donor class or the elites of the party, and that's what holds them back. If Bernie was serious, if Bernie knew his historical mission and carried it out with fidelity, in 2016, he would have created a third party. Hillary Clinton versus motherfucking Trump. That was the perfect opportunity. Fucked over by the Democratic Party. You have, there was like street confrontations in 2016, 2017 between fascist and anti-fascist, and there was real momentum, grassroots for a Bernie Sanders style takeover of the entire political system. And if he was serious, he would have sacrificed and risked his future career within the Democratic Party to spearhead a third party working class movement that took on both the parties. Instead, like a good lapdog, he sat down, he endorsed Hillary, and he's never changed that. Even in 2020 with Biden, it gets fucked over 2016 and 2020 by the Democratic Party. These people fucking hate him, and still he is subservient and loyal to them. And that is exactly why they failed and will continue to, unfortunately.
It even
That's
goes
true.
to like the question, like Henry mentioned Palestine, like what kind of rights are you fighting for? Like if you're universal health care, let's say that Bernie and AOC get in, if your universal health care and free college is built off of the mass graves of Palestinian children, what kind of future is that? That's not a future I want to live in. Like personally, like that's not the kind of socialism, quote unquote, because you know, like I don't know, like everybody has different definitions of socialism. That's not the kind of socialism that I want to live in. That kind of socialism where our privileges are built off of the backs of people in the global South.
Yeah, and that makes the distinction between social democracy and the North and South very important as well.
Absolutely. And as Marxists, we understand the deep connection between capitalism and imperialism. You can't have socialism at home and brutal imperialism and neo-colonial, settler colonial apartheid projects abroad. That undermines the very basis of it. So unless you're willing to confront that, but again, what would that cause? What would that take from Bernie and AOC to confront the genocide in Gaza in the way that they absolutely need to? It would mean confronting AIPAC. It would mean confronting not just saying Netanyahu is the reason, but the entire settler colonial project of Israel itself. It would mean confronting the elites and the donors of the Democratic Party itself. It keeps going back to the same exact thing. And they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to do that on any other front. They're certainly not willing to do it on the genocide. What they will do is mealy-mouthed, half-assed criticisms that try to do what liberal Zionists do, which is blame Netanyahu or the Israeli right for the issue instead of the entire fucking apparatus of settler colonialism. They try to, critique the capitalist system, but only to an extent. And that half-assed approach to criticism isn't going to cut it anymore. And what it does is it mystifies more than it demystifies. You actually crank up the ideological obscurantism and facilitate capitalism, imperialism by doing so, then unveiling the harsh truths and deep interconnectedness of the genocide in Palestine, the rise of the oligarchy at home, and the fundamental logic of capitalism itself. If you can't do that full bore, then you can't move forward. You just spin your wheel. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, though, is the energy, the grassroots energy that they are stoking is real. And I think that is a basis or a form of energy that socialists and radicals, revolutionaries, we shouldn't ignore that, right? They're trying to kind of co-opt that energy back into the Democratic Party, whether they're aware that that's what they're doing or not. But what is the energy there? People want radical change. They want working class economics, and they want anti-war politics. Now, that might not mean always and everywhere socialist political economy and principled anti-imperialism, but it's the seeds out of which that consciousness can grow. And so I think we have to be very critical of the leaders, while also opening up our arms and our minds and our hearts to the energy that's there, because that's precisely the energy that a socialist movement in the United States is going to have to harness and take full advantage of.
I also think like quantitative changes, like social democratic movements and their failures are sort of training grounds for the working class, right? Like the Russian Revolution didn't happen all in one final swoop. It happened through successive attempts and failures. Narodniks, this socialist movement, that socialist movement, let's try this idea, let's try that idea. And what these movements really do, and Bernie Sanders, to his credit, I mean, the Bernie to Stalin pipeline was real. Like, we can't deny that. The Bernie to Lenin pipeline, it's absolutely real. He has fermented so many people into a left position way past him. Now, I think to some extent, and to a large extent, he's outlived his utility in terms of demystifying socialism and moving people to the left. And now he's sort of just been funneling people back into Democratic Party politics. But there's still a lot of people who are still scared of big words like socialism, that he's still moving along the left pipeline. And to that extent, I think, Breht, you're absolutely right. Criticize the leaders, open up our arms to the people who are slowly moving to the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The quantity to quality point is really important, because I think we've been living through this quantitative buildup over the last 20 years. I mean, WTO in 1999, and then 9/11 and the anti-war, and then you go into the financial crisis, and then the rise of Bernie and Occupy, and then other things like Black Lives Matter and the pro-Palestine movement, which, globalized the criticism. That has been a radicalizing process for many. And even if Bernie Sanders himself still is chained to the Democratic Party, many people who he ushered leftward do naturally outgrow him, right? They start looking to his left. And then there are plenty of people listening right now who will undoubtedly say that they were moved left by the Bernie Sanders campaign or the Occupy movement if they're a little older, and that they have also outgrown the strategy of Occupy or the social democratic politics of Bernie. And so this is quantitative buildup. It feels excruciating. It's never as fast or as robust as we want. And there are, other historical examples that have outpaced this quantitative buildup, but it is a quantitative buildup. And that does mean at some point in conjunction with other crises and events, it spills over into qualitative change. Does that qualitative change necessarily mean a Bolshevik-style revolution in the U.S.? It could, or it could not. Who knows? But it could also mean a radical shift in political realignments, the emergence of brand new political parties. Who knows? But there is no doubt a 20-year quantitative buildup that it feels is coming to some sort of crescendo, and it's perfectly in parallel with the crisis of capitalism, imperialism at home and abroad.
Yeah, and the increasing economic hegemony of China in parts of the world is probably driving some of that as well. Even though, of course, all of us definitely have criticisms of China. The average American looks at China and thinks, "Well, I thought this was some, Stalinist, like horrific, dystopia, 1984 dystopia," and it seems like a lot of people there are doing pretty great, and my country's kind of declining in relevance and so on. And you can see, with in the aftermath of the Russia-Japan war, the early 20th century, that really precipitated the 1905 failed revolution. People kind of went, well, I thought all of these, East Asians were sort of feudal and backwards and whatever, and our great European colonial empire, Russia, can't even defeat them. Of course, it was very inspiring to nationalist movements, anti-colonial movements across the global South as well. And it feels like there's a little bit of that, a much grander movement there happening. And the more people see China as a place which is wealthy, which, was supposed to be this horrible place, and the US becomes an increasingly horrible and authoritarian place, that could push a lot of people in a certain direction. So it'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add to that really quick. I'm sorry for interrupting. But yeah, just the prospect of an economic collapse at home, then an imperialist lashing out and defeat globally, right? World War III or a confrontation with China, and the emergence of new examples, other societies doing different things, plus climate change in the background, AI in the background. This is the conditions. These are the recipes for a catastrophic sort of crisis and collapse, and then the possibility of total and radical rejuvenation, reform, revolutionary change. And I don't see this system being able to stop itself from flying off all of those cliffs more or less at the same time.
Yeah, they didn't get very competent fascists this time around.
Exactly.
I think to some extent sometimes I feel like we're living in like the late Qing, dynasty, like right before the century of humiliation. We're just seeing this slow and steady decline in all American institutions. Our leaders are, like you said, Henry, like dumbasses. Like at least fucking Mussolini could write a book. I don't think Trump can.
Now, to be fair, he did His power was kind of ghostwritten.
Like not to give chops to Mussolini, but like at least Mussolini knew what the fuck he was talking about. Mussolini actually read Marx. Like Mussolini understood Marxism. I mean, Trump doesn't understand anything. I think we're living in a very speed running of a century of humiliation, because like we've got these old rulers with these old ideas in like very radically new world, especially as China is rising. And so our great civilization is being confronted with like the truth that it's not a great civilization. It's not the center of the world. And yeah, it's embarrassing. It's it's horrible for us. And yet also I think to some extent it's there's something good at the end of this. It's going to be very brutal. It's definitely going to be very brutal. I also think what this is really embodied by is how different our capitalists are from the industrial capitalists of the old time. Like the industrial capitalists of the old time, like the Rockefellers and the fucking Carnegies, they knew what the fuck they were doing, right? They knew how to wield power. They had to work. Like obviously, they're exploiters, they're capitalists, they're evil bastards, but they had to work and claw their way to the top. We're living in Nepo babies, the Habsburgs. We're living in the Charles II of Spain. Like these guys cannot even fucking form words sometimes. I don't know. It's a mess.
Yeah. The inbred deformities of the ruling class replicating itself down the line.
Yeah, it's this podcast supports bloodline theory. But,
I do want to say too, I want to speak to your optimism because you're right. Short term, it's going to get fucking ugly. It's going to get way worse. We're in for a hell of a time. And it's not ammunition or hoarding food that's going to help you. It's community, family, friends, comrades that have your back and that can work together, compile resources, and help each other out when the collapse hits. But medium to long term, one thing is for sure: fascism is inherently short lived, and capitalism is inherently unsustainable. These two things are not built for the long run. They are going to fail. That failure, unfortunately, does mean short term chaos, crisis, collapse, but they're just fundamentally illogical, irrational, and increasingly unsustainable ways of organizing society, especially now that human technology has hit the absolute limits of the biosphere, of the environmental context in which all life exists. That is forcing the issue this century. And so I think we're living through scary but also exhilarating times, because I do not think 22nd century forward we're going to have capitalism. It's just impossible structurally. And it's going to try to hold on. It's going to do everything it can to hold on. And that's what fascism is going to look like. But ultimately, it is going to lose. And our job is to understand our historical moment with open eyes and to, as Fanon said, fulfill our generational obligation, right? To rise to this moment and do everything we can. We can't control the outcome. We can't control what happens politically, economically, globally, but each and every one of us can contribute, can understand the situation and contribute as meaningfully and as much as we can to pushing things in a positive direction, educating people, uplifting their consciousness, organizing in our communities and beyond. And that is not only what we should be doing as good Marxists, that is our historical obligation to ourselves, our neighbors, our community, our species.
Absolutely.
And building like parallel institutions or alternative institutions to the extent that it's possible is such an important point. But also, I don't know. I wouldn't consider myself a doomsday prepper. I don't know that. I mean, it could go in so many different ways. There's no doubt that there will be, immense crises. And another way, to look at it as well, on top of the Marxist analysis of contradiction, is that throughout history, when new technologies have caused fundamental changes in the economic base, there has been a ton of political turbulence, even before capitalism, as a result of the printing press. You can see, like, during the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the German Peasants' War, and all the chaos that caused, all kinds of, horrifying stuff. Hopefully it's not as bad as the 30 Years' War, gosh. But, the when we come upon a huge new increase in technological development, instability is inevitable. Pretty much. I mean, it already is happening. And I'm glad you brought up Mussolini, actually, because I had a quote from him I remember specifically wanting to mention, where he was asked, before he came to power, he was asked about his political program, because they, refused to have a political program. We're going to do this, that, and the other thing for the economy, whatever. And he said, and the journalist was from the Le Monde newspaper, and he said, "Our political program is very simple. We're going to break the bones of the journalists of Le Monde, the sooner the better." And I think it's a very insightful quote, because at that time, and especially when you think about technological development, at the time there were cars, airplanes. World War I had shown this horrific new face of industrialized warfare, and the people were self-help books were proliferating. People didn't really know where their place was in this new, complex, and uncertain world. And the fascists really stepped in and gave people action. They gave people a kind of, will, to misinterpret Nietzsche, like this triumph for the will, kind of, we're going to, trust us, we know what to do, we're going to do something. And it definitely seems like people, especially if you look online, lots of people are gravitating towards that, this, sun will rise again, we're kind of going to conquer all of this, this scary, uncertain jungle of modernity, of the modern world, of social media, AI, of all of these changes. But sooner or later, things will stabilize. And like you pointed out, fascism is an anti-rationalist movement. It has disdain for intellectualism and academia and human knowledge and human life. So, it can't sustain itself for very long. Even, like Adam Tooze wrote this great book about the Nazi economy, and it was already coming apart at the seams even before the war really started beating them. So, yeah, I think that touches on a lot of things, but I think that psychology of disaffected people, and then the bigger picture that it's unsustainable. Those are both important to keep in mind.
I think one of the oddest things about previous fascist movements that I don't really see happening anymore, and to some extent it kind of has, but it's not as much, is that previous fascist movements came out of the socialist movement, right? Like Mussolini, his name was Benito Mussolini. His father was a big socialist organizer. He himself was in the PSI. He wrote a lot of articles for it. He organized labor movements in Switzerland. He read Marx. His name, Benito, is literally named after the great liberal Mexican president, Benito Juarez, right? So he was a guy who was left, and then suddenly, around World War I, he sided with the reformists, the revisionists. He said, let's support World War I. And he got kicked out of the PSI. He started printing newspapers that are for pro-war, funded by big Italian industrialists. And then he starts his own party, and it's called sort of like a social fascist party, right? So he uses the fasces of Italy, this unity. And a lot of the founding members of the party are anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists who were part of the socialist movement. And we don't really see that anymore. Like today's fascists are, they don't really understand socialism. They haven't come out of the socialist movement. They aren't, because like Mussolini's base within the socialist movement was always the petty bourgeois of the socialist movement, like petty bourgeois elements that implemented themselves in the socialist movement and led to like revisionism, like left-wing revisionism, right-wing revisionism. Or in the modern day, fascists are really just rich guys, right? Like they're the bourgeois. They're nepo babies. Trump's a nepo baby. Milei is just this weirdo economist who was never a socialist. The only one I can think of is Bukele, because Bukele was part of Salvador's left-wing coalition. He did some PR campaigns for them. And then after that, he became very right-wing. He did like a very hard right-wing turn. Why do you think fascists aren't using that false socialist image anymore, that aesthetics of socialism, in order for their fascist false revolution?
Yeah, I have a thought on that. So before fascism arose, there are, as we keep referring to, these socialist working class movements, right? Mussolini comes out of that movement. His father was a part of it. He's explicitly coming out of Marxism, shifting rightward, embraces nationalism in World War I. The Nazis are contending in a terrain of struggle with the Communist Party, with the Social Democratic Party, which was also hostile to Nazism and had a lot of organized labor. We're living in industrial capitalism, post just as and right after capitalism is industrializing, which means lots of workers concentrated in big factories, which is a breeding ground for the ideological dissemination of socialism and Marxism. And so the fascism that arose had to account for the mass embrace of a basic working class politic ideology, had to confront socialist and communist movements while also trying to peel off support from them, because amongst the working class, which is the majority of society, there is large spread support for that. Even the Nazis are talking about the German Workers' Party, framing themselves in terms of nationalism, of course, but also that we are good for all Germans. Now, what is the modern fascism coming out of? It's not coming out of a background of organized unionism and militant worker movements. It's coming out of neoliberalism. And so the fascism arising today in the West is marked by its neoliberal birthing grounds, which is Javier Milei's anarcho-capitalism, which is hyper-individualism, which is a bunch of rich guys who used freedom and liberty to amass their wealth, which is the manosphere, right? Take these supplements, learn from this pickup artist, think about women in this way, go lift weights, all hyper-individualistic approaches to social problems. And so out of that, you get this grotesque sort of fascism that doesn't even have to allude to organized workers' movements or appeal to the working class as such, it's coming out of neoliberalism. And I think that, and tell me if you disagree, but I think that goes a long way in explaining the difference in quality.
No, I haven't heard it put so precisely, but that's really brilliant. I mean, do you think that that makes it just inherently less effective as well, though, on a positive note? Because the brown shirts and the black shirts, like, they really knew how to follow orders. They were like, whatever you do, like whatever you tell me you will do. Loyalty to the leaders is like valued above all. And like you see that in the MAGA movement and stuff, but like you said, because it's so hyper individualist, if you stand up to the leader, maybe you'll get some respect. It kind of eats itself.
Mm.
I mean, do you think? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something, and I think part of that is explained by unions are hyper organized, and also in a lot of these contexts, you're coming out of periods of war, so you have lots of veterans who are used to chains of command, organizing, being in battalions, cooperating, etc. And so you could have a force like the organized brown shirts on the ground, which are really the kind of cosplaying militarism at home. And then you also have an actual force to confront, which is organized workers as well, which necessitates a brown shirt like force on the ground for street fighting communists, etc. In today's West, and in particular, especially in the US, there's no real large war experience that most Americans have dealt with. There's no organization socially, like people are even just basic social organizations like the old Lions Club or bowling leagues are at all-time lows. There's no real sense of that. It's hyper individualistic, and people are coming out of a very relatively comfortable time, right? People haven't experienced Great Depressions and world wars. Not every family is full of, sons that have just gotten back from fighting abroad and are battle hardened. And so I think that adds to it. And then you have the internet, which hyper individualism, lack of organization, high levels of alienation, individualism taken for granted. And then the internet kind of further fragments society. There is no monoculture. There's no shared vision. There's not even a shared set of facts about the world anymore. People don't watch the same 3 news channels. You're now hyper siloed in your own algorithmically constructed internet bubble, which further fragments, further works against high levels of organization. And while that has been devastating to the left, it's also been devastating to the right. And the hyper individualism creates purity spirals where personalities now dominate, and there is no way for people to cohesively follow orders or get behind a single plan. The moment a fragment of the left or the right puts together some force, some organization, immediately it's criticized from all other angles. Immediately it's attacked, and that I think, again, is reflective of the hyper individualism. So I think all of those factors come into play to help explain that.
I think to some extent we do have a little bit of a paramilitary presence because like a lot of Iraqi veterans and Afghani veterans in America, like they've joined like the Proud Boys and like paramilitary organizations like that. But I think you're absolutely right, Breht, in that it's not as unified as it used to be. And, it's because we're living in a very different capitalism from the 30s, especially not like an industrial capitalism that's in the midst of a Great Depression. I also think it speaks to like how flexible fascism is, right? Like Mussolini himself was like sort of like I hate to say it, but he was sort of like a funny guy in that like you can take quotes from Mussolini and you can attribute them to Bernie Sanders or Stalin or Hitler, or like he was everywhere in the political spectrum. Yeah. There's this quote in the book that Arpam Dutt he puts there, and Mussolini's talking to his party, and his party's all like, "What's our platform?" And Mussolini's all like, "Well, we'll come up with it in 2 months. Like, we'll just come up with it on the spot. Like, we'll figure it out." Like they're making it up on the spot. And also, like, fascism is so flexible, especially the differences between Italian and German fascism. German fascism was very hyper ethno-nationalist, right? Like very anti-vehemently Jewish and Aryan race theory. Italian fascism really didn't have that. Italian fascism was more of like a class collaborationist, everything for the motherland of Italy, right? And so I think once again, like fascism, so flexible, such a flexible ideology. At the end of the day, on the outside, like fascism is like an M&M, right? The shell is this irrational ideology, right? But the inner core, like the chocolate, it's the preserving capitalism. It's the big bourgeoisie's interests. And so the shell can change, right? They can change the shell to whatever they want, right? This Trump, geriatric, dementia, whatever the fuck we got going on in the office right now. Or it can be Mussolini, who's on every side of the political spectrum, or it can be a Hitlerism, where it's like a very hyper ethno-nationalism, things like that.
Yeah, I think one thing that is generally held in common though is and like so many people on the left, I think they like kind of shirk away from the phrase national socialism, and because it's like, well, it's not really socialism, you don't want the association, and I get that, but it is a very interesting insight into fascism as well, because national socialism, like when it really, anyone who's a Marxist, anyone who's on the left has considered this before. What if you could unify nationalism with communism, with materialism? What if you could unify religion with communism? What, maybe this scientific view is too stale and too boring for people. I mean, it's something that in passing, anyone on the left has considered, but the Nazis really came out and said, we figured out this higher, new innovation in political thought, and we're everything that the socialists are, and we're also everything that the nationalists are, and we've combined them, and we've created a new, better way of doing things. And here, have some soup at our soup kitchen, or like with the RSS. India, they do like, disaster relief and stuff. People remember, they're like, yeah, nice people, whatever. And they kind of get into people's hearts that way without having to have a real comprehensive view, because the communists are talking and people's eyes kind of glaze over, and that's a problem as well too, because it's like, and especially the disdain that, a lot of people who are communists have towards religion, you could say, it's like, yeah, yeah, sure, maybe religion is superstitious and dumb. Who cares? It's not, it's not really, when you harp on those things, you alienate people. But the fascists, on the other hand, because they're really just interested in power, the leaders at least, they're opportunists interested in power. They have no problem co-opting fucking anything. I mean, Napoleon, who, of course is not a fascist, but you may be a precursor in some ways. At least this is similar. When he went to Egypt and Syria, and Palestine, invaded Palestine, he read the Quran, and he was very well versed in the Quran, and he would give speeches that made allusions to and references to, Egyptian folk tales and the Quran. He was like, I'm just gonna get really, really into all this, to try to get the Egyptian people on my side. And that's kind of what fascists are interested in doing, and above all, they emphasize a willingness to do violence, a willingness to engage in romantic, heroic struggle, and to, and promise to people that they'll be part of a great story, great fairy tale. And so they reach out to people in any given way. And they, because of that, it has no real convictions. Another reason why they can't have convictions is because they're trying to reconcile class contradiction. And you see this a lot with the Bharatiya Janata Party in India, where they really emphasize Hindu nationalism and obscure contradictions and internal issues within the country as much as possible, because there's going to be a lot of problems if people start getting more upset about exploitation and discrimination, so they have to be very vague to appeal to people, to reconcile these contradictions. And then the interesting thing is they really appeal to something in and I don't want to say human nature necessarily, but something that is it kind of in all people, which is this desire to be this hero, kind of, go on this journey, this, fantastical, be this fantastical hero, be a war hero, save your family, they appeal to these emotional, um, you know, ideas people sometimes have, and really cling and dig into that. Uh,
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah. To add my 2 cents to that is there's that deep, psychology of heroism and taking control. And there's also this reactionary nostalgia for a time that's gone by, like a golden
Mhm.
age that has been destroyed. And now we got to find the scapegoats who destroyed it. And we got to get ourselves back, which is an impossible task. And the way that you confront that is, as dialecticians, we believe in dialectical evolution. The only way out is through. There is no golden past to return to. It actually never existed. And even if it did, there's no way to go back. But it's a much easier sentiment to provoke in people. I think because of people's childhood. So I think a big part of like nostalgia and this sentimentality for a previous time is actually people misplacing their longing for the innocence of childhood onto
Mhm.
social eras. Like everybody's golden era was when they were growing up, they had a halfway decent childhood. And there's that deep human impulse to go back to a simpler, more innocent time, which actually never existed in the social realm, but did exist personally, psychologically when we were children. And so the
Mhm.
fascists have that advantage. We have to insist on reality, which is constant change and forward momentum, and evolution and progress through contradictions and the conflicts that explode out of those contradictions and the progress that is gained by those contradictions moving things forward. That's dialectics.
Mhm.
And also, the American fascism compared to Italian and German fascism is interesting. As you were saying earlier, one of you were saying that that's super flexible, it's adaptable. Just like capitalism, the system that it arises out of, it does have that unique quality of being able to adapt itself to any history and to any culture. And German culture is neurotically precise and hyper organized, and Italian culture, not to engage in simplified tropes, but
Mhm.
is bravado, and then you're coming out of workers movement, so it does have this element of organization. And in the German situation, you also have him coming out of humiliation. There's a defeat, there's an economic crisis, there's a national humiliation. It's interesting to think that US fascism at this time of capitalist crisis is coming out of hegemony, right? Just like those earlier iterations came out of more socialist backgrounds. Not that the mode of production was socialist, but there was social organization in the form of working class unions and whatnot. And they were coming out of humiliation. The US is coming out of neoliberalism and out of a declining hegemony, which I think is unique because the other iterations of fascism were not coming out of unipolarity and decades of hegemonic domination. So that adds a different flair to it. It adds a comfort, a background comfort, a certain sense of entitlement, and then all the other American accoutrement of being consumerist and hyper individualist and very very stupid. When you're the unipolar hegemon, you don't need to know about the rest of the world. You don't have a robust public intellectual sphere. America is in so many ways just very shallow intellectually already, and so the fascism is always stupid and irrational. But the fascism that emerges out of America is particularly stupid. It's almost
Mhm.
exasperatingly stupid, and I think we've kind of gestured at that. It's like they don't make fascists like they used to. Well, this is American fascism, so it has to be fucking extra dumb.
Yeah.
And it has to be hyper individualistic and personality based, very consumerist. And then, yeah, that coming out of hegemonic domination is also an interesting wrinkle as well. So it's a unique phenomenon. I think we're going to continue to see whatever fascism continues to develop out of the US be a very specifically US type of fascism.
I
And
think
I,
it
I
goes
I think
to. Oh no, go ahead, Henry.
I was just going to say briefly, the only real comparison in the sense of a country coming out of global hegemony um, would be like Oswald Mosley, and that was ultimately a pretty fringe movement
Mm,
in Britain.
Oswald
yeah.
Mosley was so weird though. Like he would purposely get beaten up in the streets and like he would make a show of it. I think to some extent he kind of is a direct line in some ways to like Trump in terms of how like he was kind of a character. He was kind of goofy. I mean, as evil as he was. Like he was just this guy who would go around, he would purposely pick fights, and then like once people would fight with him and throw him around in the street, he would like write about it and like in all the newspapers, oh my god, look at me, I got beat up. Um I I think to some extent, yeah, no, we are like living in a weird fascism compared to Italian and German fascism. We are in like an American ego versus century of humiliation sort of fight, right? And Trump very much represents that like greatness of the American past. Let's return to it. Let's get back to it. Let's rebuild our empire. And it's just not happening. I mean, China has basically in every single way won. And whether that's good or not, I think depends on your perspective. I of course, have like many critiques of China, but we're like trying to avoid our century of humiliation. It's already come. It comes in like comments like JD Vance, our vice president, he calling like all Chinese people peasants. And it's like not even like Chinese people live far better, superior lives than the average American in almost every single like living metric.
And definitely where he's from too.
Yeah. He's from the Appalachian Mountains. Like, what else? I also think like that nostalgia point that Breht had is so true. I mean, Breht, I know you're not online as us and you're not in tune with Gen Z culture, but all fascists do these days online is like post edits to Europop music from the early 2000s. Like,
I've seen that.
I mean, look, it is all we do these days too. So,
I mean, they put me onto some bangers. I mean, honestly, like one good thing has come out of fascism. Those Europop songs are good.
Sorry, if you wanted to finish, I had a larger point, so I don't want to cut you off.
I think like, what Henri was saying about the false story that like Napoleon told himself about, reading the Quran. I think that's so true too. Fascism tells itself this story, we're doing this great revolution, look at us. And really, what is it? It's always a false fucking revolution. Hitler was put into power peacefully by von Hindenburg. Mussolini, before his march on Rome, he talked to all of the advisors, the military advisors, the parliamentarians of Italy, and he was appointed basically peacefully into power. And the same thing with Trump and Trumpism. I mean, I think Trump's people, they believe in themselves in this great revolution. Trump supporters on TikTok, they'll film themselves like taking a shit, with their fists raised up in the air. If you've seen that video, like save us, President Trump, they believe in themselves as doing this great revolution. There's no revolution. It's always a false fucking revolution. And you can see it through how the Nazis had a red flag that was purposely done to mirror the Soviet flag. I mean, just stupid things like that. Go ahead, Henri.
It's tough because sometimes it feels like like I'm very out of touch with the working class to say that it's like false consciousness, like false revolution or whatever. But there's no question in the sense that you're saying it, that it's absolutely fulfilling some desire for revolution, some desire for social change. And, maybe not as much as the Nazis and the Italian fascists for sure, but it's definitely giving people the sense that they're part of something. And I mean, not to say that Napoleon was some great guy or something, obviously, especially in the Syria and the Egypt campaign and, and then in France too, like, a lot of bad stuff, but he was a genuinely revolutionary figure. And he was part of probably one of the most transformative periods of modern history. A lot of fascist leaders, they want to be a guy like Napoleon. They want to be someone like Napoleon, but they don't have any kind of view or framework or principles the way Napoleon did. I mean, at the end of the day, he did have like liberal convictions, but they want this Alexander the Great story, this Julius Caesar, conquest of Gaul type story, which in fairness, Napoleon himself wanted to, but in a way where it's simultaneously this deep nostalgia for an esoteric mythical past that never existed, and also a desire for an extremely advanced future that is brought about by the collective and unified will of the nation, unified in a militaristic way, where you kind of forge the history with your like energy and, the like will of the society or something. It's like a last ditch effort to be like, yeah, but we are actually doing something really important and really great. And this is going to change everything. Once we're done with this orgy of violence and destructive, destruction, then we'll build Valhalla. It's this kind of like very bizarre, but simultaneously very human attitude. Of like desperation, anger, bitterness. And it's interesting, that fascists and communists view one another as the epitome of everything that needs to be eradicated in the human soul, for there to be a utopian future. I mean, you could say principled, Marxists wouldn't look at them that way, because you say, well, these are disaffected workers, whatever, they're, lost, they're dumb, they're doing bad things. We have to stop them. But, if they had different material conditions, they'd be better, whatever. But in practice, communists look at these people, and we all do, look at them as just utterly evil and people that need to be, aspects of humanity, like tendencies, emotions of humans, hate, violence, greed, and so on, desire for power, that we have to get rid of if people are going to get along and have this nice future. So it's difficult, to know exactly how to deal with fascism outside of fighting it. Like what are the conditions that prevent these attitudes from developing? You look at a lot of the former Soviet countries, Ukraine, and I'm against the Russian invasion. I'm not to say that Putin's denazifying Ukraine or something, but there's no doubt that Nazism is still present in Ukraine and was there for the entire Soviet period. There's no doubt that Nazism or fascism existed throughout the Soviet period in some form in, the Soviet Union in general. And we're seeing it rear its head in places like Hungary now. And so what are the material conditions that prevent people from desiring, those kinds of things, and preventing leaders from, people who are motivated by, power, from mobilizing them and, starting these movements. Um, it's great to think that if, we have a socialist economy or get rid of capitalism, that won't be the case. But there is something interesting as well, which is an actual destructive, nihilism, within humans that, we should probably think about as well.
Yeah, I think that that's a really insightful point. And with when it comes to fascism, yeah, I think we should be aware of the psychological pitfalls of that Manichaeanism, that nice clean cut that says we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. I mean, historically, we know that we're on the right side of history, and we must fight the material forces of capitalism and fascism by any and all means necessary. But it does a lot more good for us in the long run. And I think for our movement to also try to understand the material and psychological conditions out of which fascism explodes and blossoms, and then even realize that to some degree, these are human traits and therefore they exist in us as well. And fight against fascism and against capitalism is not only an outward fight where we can project all things bad on our enemies and go out there and destroy them, but also to understand that insofar as they're human, they're not alien from us either. And those tendencies exist within us. And can we develop the maturity and the introspective capacity to find those elements within ourselves, to confront them and to uproot them as we fight externally? And I think that prevents the very common psychological act of projection, wherein the messy gray world is turned into nice and neat black and white, good guys versus bad guys. That's Marvel movie shit. That's not reality. And so we have a historical, social, outward, political obligation. I think we have a psychological inward obligation as well to transcend and uproot those aspects of us that are susceptible to that, even if they're not full on, even if they don't ever full on win, and to ultimately confront and even transcend our own egoism, which so much of this stuff is rooted in. The other point you made about Napoleon, you've been bringing up Napoleon a lot, and it kind of has me itching for all of us doing an episode on a historical materialist analysis of Napoleon, because he was a conflicted figure historically. Hegel, of course, called him history on horseback, and he was simultaneously a precursor to right-wing dictators, but also the modernizer of a product of the French Revolution, right? A Corsican nobody who could never have arisen the ranks in the ancient regime, but because of the French Revolution was given his chance through merit to emerge as this sort of, and we look on this phrase skeptically, but if it applies to anybody, it applies to Napoleon, this great man of history, which is, of course, just a confluence of historical variables that lauded him up at that time and place. But he simultaneously betrayed the French Revolution, the best parts of it, while carrying forward elements of it, right? The Napoleonic Wars were part and parcel with the modernization of Europe, the destruction of feudal monarchies and empires, and the rise of nation states, nationalism, liberalism, and capitalism itself. So he's a fascinating prism through which to understand European and perhaps world history, and is worth diving deeper on. So I just wanted to put that aside. The very last point I wanted to make is fascism as a false revolution. And yeah, I think the MAGA movement represents this perfectly. It has the emotional affectation and to some extent even the aesthetics of radical change. He's our guy. We're getting behind him. He's going to shake up the system, but you can see that we know that as Marxists, we understand that this is false, that the contradictions he's trying to resolve are irresolvable within the framework in which he's trying to resolve it. The section of the elites that back it prove on its face that it's not revolutionary, or else the entire elite class would come together to oppose it. But that is a hallmark of fascism. It gives a lot of people the false perception that real change is here, that this miserable conditions created by capitalism are going to be resolved through this reactionary uprising. But what happens? Inevitable disappointment. It can't solve the problems because it's too locked inside the system that creates them in the first place. And that does create ideological fallout in the form of more vociferous forms of violent fascism and lashing out, but also in the forms of aspects of the masses who become disillusioned with the false promises of fascism itself, but who still want real change and are therefore, I think, susceptible to some degree to a more robust socialist critique and confrontation with the whole system. That's not everybody in the fascist movement, of course, but I think especially in the American context, 50% of the voting population who votes for MAGA, I mean, already you can tell in the polling that a huge chunk of those people are immediately disabused and disillusioned. And I think that is those are elements that we have an obligation to reach out to.
Yeah,
especially with the tariffs.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, in many ways, I think fascism represents the worst aspects of humanity and class society. I mean, it is class warfare in its ugliest, most barest phase. But I think also Henri is right that there's a very human element to fascism that us socialists, us communists often ignore. I mean, I remember a couple of weeks back, Henri sent me a video of a guy, and he's this just really poor guy. He's on the verge of losing his home and rent, and he's unemployed. And I felt so fucking bad for him. I was about to donate to him, and it turned out that he was a fascist. And I think like this is a very often realized part of fascism is like the social basis of fascism is the petty bourgeois and the lumpen bourgeois, but there's also a very alienated human aspect of fascism that we can't just completely ignore through like saying like all these guys are simply evil. And also the Marvel movie watching class, like that's also the big basis of fascism. Marvel movie watchers, but it is the sort of story of fascism. You take these like people who are on the very edges of society, right? The poor, the unemployed, the lumpenproletariat, the veterans, and you give them this promise, this story that they can tell themselves, of this mythical past. We're going to return to the mythical past where everything is great. Recently, a lot of modern day fascism is based off of a return to our primitive past. Right? You'll see a lot of these guys like, let's go back to hunter-gatherer ways and like primitive primal shit and restoring our testosterone. They're even going back before class society.
It's funny because I want you to keep going, but it's funny because like, do they know you can do that? It's like, you can go do that. No one's going to stop you.
Oh yeah, nobody's stopping you from grabbing a spear and running into the forest. I mean, you can do that.
There are hunter-gatherers like today. There's like probably 2 million of them.
Yeah, go to North Sentinel Island. You know, like that's where it's at. And so they're like literally trying to go all the way back before class society. I mean, they've almost become communists, right? Like that's what us communists look towards. Like Marx looked towards hunter-gatherer societies, and they called them primitive communists. And they're looking at it, but they're looking at it for all the wrong reasons. You know, oh, these guys had so much testosterone. These guys were so much healthier. Yeah, they were healthier and happier because they didn't have fucking class society. I mean, they're so close to the right solution. I also think to some extent, I mean, the fascists of the past, I don't want to glorify them, but they had like somewhat noble reasons for becoming fascists, right? You were a veteran of World War I, and you know you got laid off, and you know you couldn't find a job because you were amputated, or you know you're a petty bourgeois small business owner and you're being crushed during the Great Depression. And you know, I mean, I always believe the petty bourgeois can go fuck itself sometimes, but you know, like of course it's, to some extent it's noble. Our modern day fascists are so fucking sad. The majority of them are guys who can't get girlfriends. Like it's just sad. It's just pathetic. I mean, it's the so many fascists, I can guarantee you, became fascists because they couldn't get a fucking girlfriend. Like, that's it.
Absolutely.
It speaks to male alienation. It speaks to how alienated we are under neoliberalism, how much we have destroyed community. Where it's like, hey, these guys, and in modern day capitalism, the only friend you have after high school and college is your wife and kids. And so because we've destroyed community so much, these men, especially woman hatred is the basis of fascism in our modern day.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up because, you know, three guys, like it should have come up earlier, but I feel like hatred of femininity or perceived feminine traits, you know, it's true that now with like the manosphere, with Sneeko, you know, I don't know, and like addiction to pornography, like amongst young men and all kinds of other things, like you do see a component of like violent hatred towards women, that really sticks out of modern Western fascism. But it feels like hatred of women has always been there, you know, from in some form. Fascism has always been a very anti-feminine movement. And like I read some interesting analyses of fascism as a, you know, form of misogyny. You know, you could say that gets into idealism or whatever, but I think it's worth considering the fact that it is such a masculine movement. Not that there's never been, you know, women in the history of fascism. Of course there have been, but not a whole lot. I mean, it's definitely an overbearing, very masculine approach to everything.
I think there's a explanation here too, and I think this is because, yeah, fascism always has this masculinist energy, but it is never it's an insecure masculinity, right? The masculinity of men who can't find girlfriends, who want to overperform. They want to overperform masculinity as a way to compensate for their lack of actual healthy forms of masculinity, whatever that may mean. So what insecure masculinity necessitates is a policing of the borders of masculinity, wherein trans people, gay people, and women themselves must be subordinated as a performance of masculinity. Now, if you know somebody who is a man and is comfortable in his masculinity, they're not the type that hate women or that need to shit on trans people or be homophobic against gay people. Why? Because they're comfortable in themselves. People who are okay with themselves, who are comfortable in their own skin, don't need to constantly degrade, lash out, and denigrate others. That always comes from an insecure place. And because fascism is rooted in economic insecurity, in cultural insecurity, and social insecurity, that all obviously cuts to the heart of individual fears around masculinity. And in America, where masculinity has historically been framed in terms of a provider and a protector, you don't have the capacity to provide anymore. Well, that strikes at the core of what it means to be a man. And unless you're willing to really think through and be vulnerable and, you know, have certain emotional intelligences and capacities for introspection, that's quickly going to turn into a hatred of the threats to masculinity, which are seen as the non-masculine. And those aspects need to be suppressed and subordinated, which is an outward projection of your inward struggle with your own insecurities. And so fascism and this insecure masculinity have always gone together in every culture, right? In the German and the Italian and in the American examples, that is one feature that stays the same. And I think that is really, really worth thinking deeply on. And then on the other point I wanted to point out is we were talking about primitive communism and like this one thing to go back to a previous time, even the primitive communist time, and then but it's not framed in terms of community, it's framed in terms of like, well, they just had higher testosterone. And there's an interesting parallel in the MAGA movement where they say make America great again. And if you ask a lot of them when was America great, they'll often say, if they don't go crazy, they'll say stuff like, the 50s or the 60s. And then they also marry that to an idea of bringing back manufacturing jobs like we used to have, right? But again, they get the cause wrong. The cause of prosperity back in the 50s or whatever was not because of manufacturing jobs, nor was it because of the cultural chauvinism of the 50s. It was because of post-World War economic conditions, but also high rates of unionism. Manufacturing jobs are not prosperous in and of themselves. They were prosperous historically in this country because they coincided with the time of low inequality and high unionism. But that is completely excluded from the conversation. And so what is nostalgically grasped for is the manufacturing jobs and the culture of the 50s without any acknowledgement of what made those things prosperous in the first place for the sort of person that looks back on those times favorably. So yeah, those are crucial components to this new form of fascism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Well, no, go ahead, Henry. I got a bigger point.
Okay. Yeah, I just had I had one point, but it's actually two halves of different points, so it won't be too long. But that's a very good point, and in some ways, the difference between communism and fascism, or at least the most succinct way you could put it, is that fascism picks these aesthetic goals and it tries to achieve them through some, again, and I actually. I really do like Nietzsche a lot. I hate how they've misinterpreted him so much, but this triumph of the will kind of, well, if we have these goals etched in our minds, if we unite people, we will achieve them, whatever good, quote unquote, good thing they want. Whereas communists say, approach the world from a critical perspective and say, well, how does it work? And then how can we use our understanding of, the material functions of society, how things work, and adjust, to think about how we can improve things to achieve, certain goals. And, and of course, capitalists prefer the first one. And then I think when it comes to, it's interesting you mentioned the insecurity men feel if they're unable to be providers or whatever. This might be a huge oversimplification, but it seems to me, especially in the past, and maybe not to the same degree in the United States today, but certainly in many ways, women are much more familiar with precarity, with precarious life, with really having to deal with society in different ways. Whereas when men who are, you're kind of told, well, you've got to do this and provide for a family, but also kind of encouraged in certain ways and kind of are taken more seriously, by some people and so on. When that feels like it falls through for them, and of course, you look at societies in general, men are overwhelmingly more violent. That kind of gives a lot of gasoline on the fire of fascism as well. It's that specific kind of difference in the way that men and women experience society a lot of the time.
I think one thing that's been unmentioned throughout this podcast is how fascism, modern day fascism, has reutilized all of those old anti-Semitic stereotypes and sort of made Arabs the new Jews, really, in a lot of ways, especially migrants and things like that. And I really think Israeli society is sort of a projection, as sort of future look at where America is at least on course towards devolving towards. Because, Israeli society, it always envisioned itself as very secular and democracy-like, and slowly but surely, rather than going completely fascist and having like a one-party Likud rule in one final foul swoop, it slowly devolved over time, over and over and over time, and it sort of surprised a lot of Israelis. Like they believed that they were in this beautiful secular democracy, and next morning they woke up in a sort of essentially what is now a one-party dictatorship under Likud, under Netanyahu. And it's kind of amazing how Zionism and Jewish fascism, which of course it doesn't represent all Jews, but Zionism, which is Jewish fascism, has sort of meddled its way into all of these European right-wing circles, these fascist circles, patriots.eu, which is a meeting of all their alt-right parties, and it has utilized all of these anti-Semitic tropes, the Jews control Europe, the Jews control this, and they've turned it onto the Arabs, they've turned it into the migrants, the Great Replacement theory. Who is directing the Great Replacement? That was always the Jews, and suddenly instead now it's the shadowy figure that's using Arabs to, replace Europeans. And so our modern day fascism, it has a disgusting ethno-nationalist character, and it's using Jewish fascism, especially within Europe, as a sort of foment to justify itself. It's like, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, so it's okay. And it's turned all of these anti-Jewish frameworks onto Arabs and, African migrants.
It's interesting you mentioned that whole thing, because the Eurabia conspiracy theory, like that repurposing, is really done by the Zionist Breht O'Shea. Like she was really the first one to do that as a Jewish woman, in seemingly an act of in-grouping herself. I mean, that might be a very crude way to read it, but this idea that Islamic elites are trying to Arabize Europe, turn it into an Islamic state. It really does come from, in many ways, the Zionist movement itself. And then, of course, anti-Semitism from the beginning was always about combating Middle Eastern influence. Jewish people cannot belong in Europe from the perspective of the anti-Semite because they're Middle Eastern. That's where they're really from. So it always had that anti-Arab, racism down at the root.
Yeah. I just wanted to quickly say too, with the Israel on the far right, you're right that there is this shifting to the Arab, and I think that's really been just drenching American society in the post 9/11 world. And you can see how that post 9/11 rhetoric is still utilized and marshaled today by the ruling class in support of Israel. Just the idea of just the colonial mentality of them being like savages, subhumans, and that takes the form of the word terrorist today. It's like Hamas, the army that the Palestinians use to fight back, are the terrorists, but the brutal regime that is occupying, imposing apartheid, ethnic cleansing, mass murder, genocide on an ethno-religious supremacist basis is somehow not terrorist, right? It's an absurdity, but there's still the contradiction, because the right-wing reactionaries, they want Israel in the sense that they want to be supremacists, and they want a society rooted in violence and exclusion of the other. But the anti-Semitism still definitely exists on the right. So that will often come in conflict. And it comes in conflict within Trump's foreign policy, which there are, lots of aspects of MAGA, which you would expect, which are anti-Semitic and who believe in this America First concept and believe Israel is a threat to the America First aspect, as well as this other side of the ruling class and the administration that are ready to go to war with Iran for Israel. So how that contradiction plays out is going to be interesting, but Israel is losing support amongst all younger Americans across the political spectrum. And that, I think, spells long-term threats to Israel, which depends on U.S. money and military aid for its very survival, especially in that region. And U.S. obviously uses Israel as a major, crucial foothold at the crossroads of three continents as well. So it's a mutually beneficial society, but both are situation, but both societies are in decay. And there's a certain sort of accelerationism, a death drive accelerationism present in both societies as they enter what I believe to be their final phases. I don't think Israel or the U.S. are going to survive in their current forms, in the second half of this century. And so we're going to see how this plays out, but it feels like they're going down together no matter what. And Palestine really is the testing ground, because if you want to entrench and keep in place this rotten, unsustainable system, that's going to create mass immiseration for the many and popular discomfort and rebellion. And so the only way to box that in, to suppress that, eventually is once you lose the more subtler mechanisms that liberal capitalism have developed, it's going to increasingly have to look like the way that the Israelis are suppressing the Palestinians. And so in that sense, Palestine is the testing ground. And here at home, the emergence of cop cities are the bases of operations out of which that sort of heavy-handed, explicit, violent, suppressive fascism will explode. And so keeping our eyes on Palestine and the development of cop cities, I think, are crucial for our understanding of where things are going.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Israel is just America 20 or 30 years in the future. I mean, it's so similar, and in a lot of ways, especially how we're currently degrading and eroding rights and we're creating second-class citizens, even more so. I mean, undocumented migrants have always been second-class citizens. It's very similar to what was done in Israel. I mean, Israel was, and of course it's not a real democracy and it was built on stolen land, but it was in some aspects functioning as somewhat of a democracy, like a liberal democracy. And slowly but surely over time, it started to degrade. And now it's a military occupying force with a very heavy-handed second-class citizenry, where it's got like separate courts for Palestinians, and it's got an occupying force, and it's got a one-party rule, essentially, the Likud party. That's the future of America. And even if you can't recognize that, and if you think somehow, and there's this liberal avarice, right? There's this liberal avarice. Let's focus on what's at home and let's not focus on what's abroad. But these two stories are essentially tied in so many ways that's impossible to separate it. I mean, it goes again. I think a lot of these well-meaning liberals fall into national socialism to some extent. Let's focus on welfare at home for while we abandon the Palestinians, the people abroad. That is essentially just a nationalist form of socialism, accidentally invented by I think your well-meaning aunt who wants to focus on things at home and saying forget about Palestinians. But it really is interconnected. The global working class is interconnected. It's an impossible thing to do. It's an impossible contradiction to divide.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw I did want to mention just before we end, it really tied into your earlier point, but I saw this Haaretz article this week that went, Israel didn't start off racist. It was only once the Russian revolutionaries got involved that it became racist. And I thought that really hit home a lot of, what we've been talking about, because I mean, gosh, just the existential disillusionment and dread. I mean, you have to be feeling to write something so nonsensical.
Yeah, absolutely. Boys, this has been an absolutely fun conversation. What's our plan for CCOT? What are we going to do once we get sent to CCOT?
Good question.
We got to squad up and organize. Yeah,
squad up. I'm gonna start working out. Henry can write some books. Breht will start an in-prison podcast. Yeah, we'll be able to upload it anywhere, but it'll keep our minds active. This has been a fun conversation. Breht, tell people where they can find you. If you guys have any final concluding remarks, let's get them out.
Yeah, final concluding remarks. Great conversation. These are the things that all of us need to be thinking about and wrestling with. And climate barbarism is in the background of all of this. And the current elite is going to go for climate fascism, violent borders, eco-apartheid, imperialism for resources, as they increasingly try to cement an unsustainable minoritarian rule at home. And so the fight's ahead of us, and we all got to get educated and organized. And I think people listening to this podcast know that, but it's our deep existential obligation and responsibility. But yeah, I really do love talking to both of you. And now this is 2 episodes we've done together that have been wonderful. And I would love to continue collaborating with you. But as for me, you can find everything politically relevant I do at revleftradio.com.
And then Henry, you got any concluding remarks?
Yeah, Henry Martel on Substack, and yeah, it was a great conversation. Really appreciate talking to you, Brett. And too bad we didn't get to Japan. Ran out of time, but Imperial Japan's a whole interesting set of questions on this topic too. So lots to talk about, and much to consider. And yeah, I'd love to have you on another time as well. And yeah, stay educated and get organized.
Absolutely. The Maoist in Trump's brain, please save us. The Maoist in Trump's brain, please take over. And you guys have a good one.
Peace.
Bye.
Yeah.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
На высокий берег на крутой.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.